I'm one of the members at large for the Education and Behavioral Sciences section of ACRL, and that is the group that is hosting today's virtual discussion about preprint repositories in the social sciences. And I could not be more delighted with our illustrious panel of experts today who are here to share their wisdom. We have Dr. Philip Cohen, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park, and also a director of SocArchive. We have Will Cross, who is the director of the Copyright and Digital Scholarship Center at NCSU and a SciArchive steering committee member. And finally, we're joined by Judy Rutenberg, who's Program Director for Strategic Initiatives at ARL and also a SocArchive steering committee member. They're going to share with us a wealth of knowledge today about preprint repositories. But before they do, I want to thank my fellow member at large, Rachel Elrod, for her assistance in planning this event, as well as ACRL for hosting it. And I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions as the meeting progresses for our panelists, please go ahead and put those in the chat. I'll be monitoring that chat and interjecting questions as we go along and also saving some of them for the end in the interest of time. If you have technical questions, please go ahead and send a direct message to Elois Sharp. That account is also being monitored for any technical issues or difficulties you might have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Philip, who will begin our discussion today. And thank you all for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much. Stop me if you can't hear me. I'm very happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to talk about SocArchive and preprints generally. This is the order that we're going to go. I'm going to talk about SocArchive, why and when research use it, and some common sort of pros and cons. Then we'll have the SciArchive perspective with Will on also why they use it and the issues having to do with copyright licensing and policy. And then Judy will come in with the library issues having to do with what you see there, metadata discovery, citations, and so on. So I'll get right into SocArchive to introduce it. So what is SocArchive? It's an open archive of the social sciences. We host research papers. We live on the platform of the nonprofit Center for Open Science. And on that platform are a community of scholars and librarians building research infrastructure. So the goal is to provide a space for people to share their research in a nonprofit open source and open access platform. We're part of the preprint revolution. However, preprints is not really a concept that sociologists use that much. We have all manner of social science, also arts, humanities, education, and law on our server, but we were sociologists who started it. We don't differentiate so much between the kinds of papers, but we do, people call them sometimes working papers, sometimes preprints, sometimes postprints. We just call them papers formally. With that in mind, there still are sort of categories of use or use cases that fit under those definitions. Working papers are essentially a draft of a paper that's ready to read, something that's not yet peer-reviewed, and with the explicit implication of more revisions to come. So that's one category of use. Preprints obviously have some overlap with working papers. The term is more common in some disciplines than others. These apply a little bit more finish, something often ready to be peer-reviewed or ready to be perhaps presented at a conference, but something that's not yet accepted. For some disciplines in particular, it's very important that these are defined as not peer-reviewed so that they're still eligible for consideration in certain publications that have that as a restriction. And then Finally, postprints are an open access version of a paper that has been published somewhere. Here they are peer reviewed, and they may be with or without the journal formatting. So if somebody may post a working paper, then submit it to a journal, then it gets accepted, and then they come back to SocialArchive and they post a new version, which is the final author version. So it's it has all the content of the journal version, but not the formatting. That looks a lot like a preprint, but if the thing has already been published, it's sort of also a postprint. And one of the things we do in that case is provide people the opportunity to enter a DOI to link it to the published version, and make sure that readers can follow through to the journal, and also that the citations will eventually get aggregated, and so on. We'll talk more about that. So why do people use it? This is our pitch to authors, and we find these are the sort of leading reasons. Time is probably the number one. Authors spend years working on their research and then end up spending months or even years waiting for it to be published. So for a lot of people, what we're doing is filling that gap. And especially because when people are happy and proud of their work and they've submitted it somewhere, they're all ready for an audience to read it, and yet now it's going to just languish in the inbox of some reviewer whose arm had to be twisted to read it, and they don't even really want to read it. So it's a disappointing and sad time for researchers. So we're filling that gap by letting them get it out there. Social scientists, probably more than people in some other disciplines, really hope that the public will read their work, or at least some publics, some people out there, not just other academics. And so the open access feature of the system is extremely important to people. It's a way of distributing the work sort of off campus. And then the connection aspect is, we want to try to encourage people to open up the conversation about their research out of their own personal network into a slightly wider audience of other scholars, and to take that interacting part of the process away from the publishers, if you will, and speed it up and bring it to that very specific audience of other researchers who might become collaborators if they can see the work at an earlier stage. So more efficient, more engaging, more inclusive. I'll just give one example sort of a success story. After Hurricane Maria last year, we had a paper by Alexis Santos and Jeffrey Howard that was very popular, estimating the excess mortality on the island. They posted it right away in November, within a month of their data collection, and were able to get the word out about the paper, and it was downloaded a few thousand times and got some extensive media coverage right away. And that led them to connect with other people who were working on estimating the consequences of that hurricane using different methods, and there was a lively and sometimes contentious debate about methods that ensued afterwards. Some of that has now been published in other journals, but in that case, when we had sort of a rapid response need for a project, we were able to fill that need for those researchers. So we encourage people to share their work when they're ready for some feedback, when they're looking for potential collaborators. If they're a little bit more less adventurous, or they're tentative about their work, at the point at which they're submitting it to a conference or a journal is often a good time. That's when they're already prepared to share it with a group of strangers. So they may as well widen that circle, or at least that's something to consider. And then often when the paper is accepted, we see authors going on social media or saying to their friends, boy, I've got a great paper accepted. And people start saying things like, oh, I can't wait to see it. But then they have to wait to see it. So we're there to help them just show it to people at that moment. And then, of course, after it's published, as a way to provide an open version. Okay, so why are people not doing this when the advantages seem to be so great? One common concern is it's not good enough. I want to have my work peer reviewed before I share it. Our argument on that is that it's okay to be proud and share it. and still respect and use the peer review system. And it's also okay to be wrong, and to be willing to take that risk a little for the advantages of earlier sharing. A lot of authors are concerned if they share their work, they're not going to be able to publish it later. Most journals, including the journals of the American Sociological Association, will publish papers that have been shared on a preprint server. They usually will not publish papers that have already been submitted to a peer-reviewed journal. There are some journals that don't allow pre-printed papers to be submitted, and we just suggest that people not use those journals because that's not in the interest of scholars and their work. And then the flip side of the it's not good enough is sort of the it's too good and somebody's going to steal it. And people are often afraid that by sharing it, they put themselves at greater risk of that. We make the opposite argument that by sharing it early, you get precedence. You can post it with a timestamp and make sure the word gets out. Look, I'm working on this. I've got some results. I've got some research to show on this. And then that is, we think, the best protection against later being scooped. There's a common perception I'm sure you're all familiar with that things that are open access are sort of low quality and look desperate. We do stress that just posting a paper on Social Archive is not a symbol of its quality. It doesn't mean you've done good work. It just means you've done work. We have moderation on the site, but it's very it has a very low bar to acceptance. If it is research and you did it and it's correctly attributed, we're pretty much going to post it. So we want to counter that idea that open access stuff is low quality and try to change the culture. So all we can do is keep chipping away at that. There are issues with licensing that we'll talk more about, but some people are afraid that their academic work is going to be used by some profiteering company. We want to at least make the argument that maybe that's great. As long as you're still able to distribute it for free, you're not really losing anything if somebody else is selling it. It may just be if someone else can find a way to get it into more people's hands and package it in such a way that someone wants to pay for it. We think that's great, and we encourage scholars to look at it that way. And a lot of people are also concerned that they don't have a right to share their work, that they've signed an agreement, the agreement is long and technical, they didn't really read it that carefully, they're not sure what version they're allowed to share, and so on. We provide links to the Sherpa Romeo database and encourage people to read their author agreements, to consult their librarians, and find a way to share their work, which is, after all, the point of doing the work. I'm going to conclude. I encourage you to contact me or have people at your institutions contact me or Social Archive directly. You see the addresses for the Social Archive account at the bottom there, and we're always happy to get queries and questions. On our website, Social Open, there's a frequently asked questions page which answers a lot of questions, and also there's a link there to a tutorial and some videos, and we try to make it as accessible as possible to new users. So thanks very much. I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Philip. And I'll remind our attendees that they can put questions in the chat box. But for now, I'll just pass it on to our next speaker, who I believe is Will Cross.
Just right. Thank you. I'm going to see if I can take the ball here. Great. I feel so powerful. I have the Powerball. So, hey everybody, I'm Will. As Cass said, I'm the director of the Copyright and Digital Scholarship Center at North Carolina State, which means I'm kind of the lawyer in the library. And I'm also on the board of SciArchive, so we figured it would be useful for me to give you sort of a quick overview of a service that has risen up sort of in response to or in emulation of the great stuff that Philip talked about, and then to talk a little bit about the copyright and licensing stuff as well. So SciArchive is one of these services that has said, that's a great idea, Phil. We want to do that too. We want to bring that to our own community. And so it's been designed to engage with the psychology community in similar ways to the stuff that Philip talked about as well. And a lot of the value proposition comes from our connection to the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, which you can sort of read their mission statement here, but again, it's going to sound like a lot of the things that Phil talked about. We're improving training and research practices, we're improving institutional policies, we're sort of engaging with both scholarly communication writ large and with the specific practices and careers of individual folks in psychology. And as we sort of dig into that why PsyArchive piece, I've sort of framed this in two areas. The first is about pace and scope, that we see preprints as a really important way to change the pace and scope of the way psychology sort of creates and shares information. I think Phil did a great job of talking about the connections between preprint servers and open access, public access, citizen access, et cetera. We talk about that in our own mission statement in the context of sort of moving beyond paywalls that relegate access to a privileged few. And we say an insular, rigidly hierarchical science is a sick science, right? That in psychology we've been thinking a lot about what are our values and how do we do better in a lot of ways, and that open access piece is incredibly important to that. Another important piece that Phil sort of mentioned is this idea of speeding up research as well. That it can be truly months or years from completing the study and having something important to share before you get to share it. So if you have to wait that whole time, it slows down the pace of the research for an individual, but also a preprint server provides the opportunity to plant a flag for the individual researcher, to say, I'm an early career researcher. It's important for me with this tenure clock hanging over my head to demonstrate the good stuff that I'm doing. And a preprint server gives you an opportunity to do exactly that. So that's the pace and space piece. We also think a lot about this idea of the quality of scholarship and the qualities of scholarship as well. So this idea of wider peer review that we think about in terms of open access generally, that the sort of traditional peer review process is grounded in sort of novel, positive, unexpected results, but it's tremendously important for us to share negative results, to share sort of the less glamorous, flashy results that are still so central to making sure we're doing the work that we're doing. The reproducibility crisis in recent times has given psychologists an especially sort of keen moment to think about those issues, but it's tremendously important if I release some findings for somebody else to be able to go back and say, yep, that was right. But it can be hard to publish a reproducibility study that just basically confirms. So a preprint server is a place to have that reproducibility conversation in some important ways. And then finally, sort of to open up the file drawer, as it were, right, to share the sort of things that might not be published in other contexts. And that can be about sort of thinking about boundary conditions and what's useful, even if it's not flashy or exciting in a new way. That can be the reproducibility stuff we've talked about. And in particular, sort of the failed study problem, right? That if I go out and do a bunch of research and things don't go well, I don't find anything good or useful, that's probably not going to get published, but it's tremendously important that people know that's a dead-end path, because if that's not shared, then other people are going to walk down that same path, run into that same dead end, not tell anybody about it, and then a third person will walk down that path, and so forth. So that process of not sharing our failures makes it such that those failures are repeated. They end out sort of draining public funds and wasting time. So a preprint server for psychology in particular gives us the opportunity to share those negative results, those disappointing results, in a space that other people can benefit from them, even if they don't rise to the level that the most prestigious journal in the world would want to print them because they know it's going to be, on the front page of the New York Times or something. So pace and then quality and qualities are sort of the areas as we talk theoretically. I wanted to bring this down into more of a concrete space, and I really like the example of Dr. Nordman. She's an instructor at Aberdeen, and she has, I think, a really nice story about her experience as a new and then early career researcher, sort of trying the traditional path and then jumping into PsyArchive as well. Don't worry about reading this tiny text. I'll sort of talk you through it a little bit, but I wanted to show her face because she's, I think, doing great stuff and provides us a really good example. So the gist of this great story in 6 acts is that in March of 2017, she finishes some research she's very proud of. She's an early career researcher. It's going to be important for her promotion and tenure package. And she feels like she's done the methodology really well. She submits it to a very prestigious journal, TM, And they basically say this is good. It's not, doesn't really rise to the level of the sort of thing we publish. So a month later, she has done her work and shared it and gotten some useful feedback. She then submits it to a smaller but still fairly prestigious journal, and she waits 6 months, and then she finally hears back, and basically what she hears back from the reviewers are, this is a great research, you've done strong foundational work here, it's not novel enough for us to publish, so good luck to you. And her response, as you can see in the sort of all caps on the left there, is, this is what's wrong with science, you could have told me that 6 months ago, you just needed to read my abstract, right? So she's got the tenure clock hanging over her head, time is absolutely of the essence, and she's already been half a year and not really gotten anything out of it so far. So she keeps going. In October of 2017, she submits to another small sort of prestigious journal. She waits for 2 months. She reaches out again and says, hi, I'd really like to move this forward. And their response is, sorry, we haven't even assigned an editor yet. It's going to be another 3 months before we can even find an editor. And then they're going to have to find the reviewers and move it out. So it could be a little while. And she uses some not safe for work language here in the top middle slide, but basically she says, this is going nowhere. This is hugely frustrating. I'm not getting good feedback on my work. I'm not sharing my work. I'm going to take the plunge. I'm going to try out this preprint server and see how that goes for me. And very quickly, by January of that year, she's been invited to advise on a paper, which becomes a review article, which she quite properly also then submits to SciArchive as well. She's invited to present at a conference based on the preprint that people have seen. At that conference, she meets a collaborator and she starts a new paper, which is again submitted to SciArchive. And then by July of this year, she's offered a lectureship. She's got a full-time position. And I think she says it really well here in this last of these 6 slides. Obviously, 2 preprints didn't seal the deal, but they wanted to see a record of pedagogical research, which I was able to give them because of the preprints, right? The journals were not going to have that record out there in time for her to get this job, but the preprint server sort of got it out there into the ecosystem and connected her to some good people as well. There's also sort of a funny postscript to this. She says, based on this thread itself that she posted on Twitter, I've been invited to write a piece about preprints, the internet, not just for cats and porn. And I think that's really important because SciArchive is about sort of improving the discipline of psychology and planting the flag, as we talked about, but it's also about that larger question of scholarly communication, right? Preprints give researchers a way to build and control a scholarly identity and to connect with the larger ScholComm community in new and more impactful ways, right? The happy moment here, the punchline here isn't just, oh boy, I got tenure. It's I met a new colleague. I'm advising a new person. I'm engaging with the community in some new ways. And so in that context, preprint servers are part of a larger sort of scholarly communication ecosystem that empowers researchers to improve their practices and the discipline as a whole. So I think that's a sort of a pretty exciting piece of it, and we love what we're doing with SciArchive in that space. These new practices naturally sort of raise some questions about how the legal issues related to copyright and ownership fit into this stuff. Again, I think Phil gave you a nice preview of some of these issues, but I wanted to dig into them a bit more as well. So the first question that you tend to get asked is like, am I allowed to share my work at all? Is it okay that I do this? Am I going to get in trouble? And the answer to that, of course, is yes, it's fine. Copyright is an author's right, which means that if you make it, you own it, and you have the right to share it with other people. And you also have the right to license it out on a service like SciArchive or SociArchive or any of the other archives as well. We've got some resources around sort of the practices of licensing here. We tend to suggest that people use the Creative Commons just because that's the sort of standard framework that people are familiar with and because it empowers authors to make some choices about how their work can and cannot be used. I know Phil was articulating the value of CC BY or even CC 0. I've certainly talked to authors who said CC and C is the right fit for me or others, but that CC framework, whichever license you pick, is sort of, it's available to you. I'll say when you look at what we've been doing in SciArchive so far, it's been predominantly CC BY licenses that have been placed on there with some CC 0 as well. And then some people just upload without a license. And that basically means that they are sharing it so you can read it. If you want to do anything else with it, you're either going to need to talk to them about that issue or to rely on fair use or some of those other copyright exceptions that exist in different jurisdictions. We don't need to get into the weeds on CC any further right now, but obviously if you have questions about how the licenses work or how they fit in the context of preprints, we've got some Q&A time to talk about those issues. sort of in particular. So that's the first question, can I do it? The answer is absolutely yes, emphatically, no question about it. There's some good infrastructure there. The larger question, and again, I think Phil touched on this really well, is like, yeah, but can I still be published? It's not great if I can do it, but then I lose my ability to publish. And the good news here is that once again, it's generally fine to do exactly that, right? Phil mentioned this site Sherpa Romeo, which is a great way if you've already published and you want to upload to a preprint server. It's a good thing to know about. It's also a really nice tool if you want to shop around a little bit, right? Because it gives you the general policy. If you say, I want to participate in preprints because of those benefits that I heard about, but I want to make sure the journal is okay with it, you can go into Sherpa or just reach out to an editor and have that conversation there as well. So there's sort of the legal infrastructure for doing that stuff and a set of expectations for doing that stuff as well. In psychology, we're sort of especially lucky because a few months ago, the American Psychological Association named SciArchive as their preferred preprint server for APA titles, with plans to integrate with the submission portals for some APA published journals. So not only is submitting to SciArchive not a problem, it's not going to prejudice an APA journal. In fact, the workflow is actually going to make moving from preprint to published article that much simpler. So not only is it okay and are you not going to get in trouble, it actually is sort of anticipated, and the APA, the large organizations, are sort of recognizing some of the values that we're talking about here in terms of sort of better peer review and faster pace and these sorts of things. So SciArchive really benefits from existing in this community that recognizes the importance of these issues, both from an, oh my goodness, we've got a reproducibility crisis, to a, this serves individual researchers better. So that's sort of the quick and dirty on SciArchive and practices, and then some of the legal and licensing issues as well. As I say, I'm happy to jump into those a little further as we move into the Q&A section, but I do want to make sure I don't step on Judy's time. So what I'm going to do now is actually pass the Powerball over to you, Judy, and let you talk about the role of librarians.
Okay, thank you so much. Looks like I have the ball. So, libraries and preprints. Thank you so much for having me on this webinar. I am Judy, and I work for the Association of Research Libraries, which is a membership organization of 125 of the largest research libraries in the U.S. and Canada. During the 7 years or so that I've worked here, I've worked on a number of projects for the association, including SHARE, which is actually a small part of the preprint story that I'll address later, and also what we've been calling Academy-owned open access, where libraries take a leading role in providing infrastructure for OA publishing, and in particular have taken a great interest in what might be done in collaboration with preprint services. So I'm now concentrating on supporting our membership around the area of open scholarship kind of writ large. And for us in the association, that means deep engagement, not just with, of course, our member libraries, but with the research community, including faculty, academic leadership, funders, societies, and in the preprint communities, sort of how to support open practices to meet community needs and requirements. So I'm happy to serve on the SocIarchive steering group. I'm very proud that SocIarchive and SciArchive have library representation on their steering committees, and really even prouder that many of the other preprint communities that the Center for Open Science has hosted and spun up services around have included librarians as well in building out their services and working through issues where we really have significant expertise. So I just want to talk for about a few things, areas where I think libraries have a strategic interest in participating in the preprint movement, in this case in the social sciences, but broadly. So the three reasons that I will assert for this, and I'd love to hear if we have time in the discussion, others from the audience. But one, we've long been advocates for open scholarship. Two, many academic and research libraries take a kind of research lifecycle model approach to their services, the desire and interest in supporting researchers at every stage, so including pre-publication in this case. And that three, we're responsible as stewards of the scholarly record. Many of you will remember last year, Clifford Lynch published an editorial in College and Research Libraries, sort of setting out a new agenda for scholarly communication. And he talked about preprints. Preprint servers such as Archive have played a transformative role over the last 20 years, he said, in accelerating the creation and dissemination of knowledge and in democratizing those processes, something we heard from both Philip and Will. Anything that academic and research libraries can do to accelerate and support this trend will have very high payoffs in terms of better, more effective scholarship. And this includes the sort of ellipses there for disciplines that haven't traditionally been accustomed to sharing pre-publication. The support that anything that we can do, the support that academic and research libraries can provide can be financial under certain, under kind of membership models. It can be community support. The University of Maryland libraries have provided support for SocArchive's annual conference. It could be an infrastructure and hosting, repository support, or other. So while libraries, as I said, have long been, and you well know, have long been advocates for open access, we, the kind of research community, the academic community, are now really at a point where many of the key decision makers and influencers, such as federal agencies, private foundations, most recently the national academies, in a consensus report around open science, are setting expectations around for scholars around open scholarship and data sharing. And much of the expertise to make that kind of a system work, what the academies call open science by design, that expertise resides in libraries. This includes, where and how to deposit into repositories, what good metadata looks like, how to write a good data management plan. And as preprints mature in the social sciences and in disciplines that are new to this, we need to bring our experience, that experience and expertise to the table. Supporting preprints is also aligned with the research lifecycle kind of service model, where libraries support research from, the discovery and ideation phase, and sort of every step along the way to dissemination and preservation of scholarship. And this lifecycle approach is really well known to librarians supporting research data management, but broadly, more broadly as well. And when we say, when we support discovery, we mean, helping people discover, of course, what's out there in the world, but also making local assets discoverable and interoperable by, promoting and using persistent identifiers, ORCIDs, DOIs, so that scholarship can be interlinked. For example, in the example Philip gave, linking a preprint to a published paper, but also to related materials. This was a kind of central goal of the SHARE initiative I mentioned earlier, to aggregate metadata, interlink scholarly assets. And when COS launched its preprint platform with SocArchive as I believe the first one, it already had SHARE. It had built SHARE as an index, which was harvesting metadata from previous preprint servers, Archive, bioRxiv, services in economics and cognitive sciences, along with all the new kind of branded services that they host. And another goal of SHARE was to enable that metadata to be kind of not just aggregated, but exchanged easily, so that disciplinary preprint services didn't see themselves sort of in competition with institutional repositories when we're all kind of trying to make scholarship more open. How do we make that work together? So this, kind of embracing this life cycle kind of service model, in this context means librarians, we keep track of things like which funding agencies allow you to cite preprints in a proposal, sort of in the context of, consulting on a grant opportunity. How do the faculty you work with feel about students reading and citing preprints? Do they know about them? So, there may be conversations to be had here in the context of library instruction, of information literacy, of how we engage with with faculty. And of course, many academic libraries like North Carolina State have somebody like Will with great expertise in copyright and licensing and publishing and all of those very difficult issues that scholars face. So I really want to make sure to give a shout out and call attention to the Library and Information Science Scholarship Archive LISA. This is also hosted by the Open Science, it's on the Open Science Framework platform. It's hosted by the Center for Open Science. librarians, of course, are scholars too. And you can see that LISA calls a deposit a work, which, if you read their, kind of about page, it signals a very expansive definition of what they want to include. A couple of years ago, some colleagues and I deposited a grant narrative there, exactly the kind of thing that you usually sort of, file away, but we hope others will read and benefit from, and maybe we'll find people doing similar work and we'll kind of combine efforts and coordinate. So if you aren't familiar with LISA, I recommend sort of looking around it for what, for what's there, and then kind of thinking and inquiring and having conversations in your own departments and communities of practice about, your ability to share LIS scholarship or your comfort level around sharing in this way. And some of the points that Philip described, going to a conference, et cetera. So the third, sort of big strategic reason that we, want to be involved in this conversation is our role in stewarding the scholarly record. With all of the emphasis that both previous speakers described around digital scholarship, public engagement, open science, that scholarly record increasingly includes preprints. And, frankly, we probably have more questions than answers at this point. Peer review is a big one. It is sort of excitingly being reimagined through the preprint and in disciplines looking at open peer review models, such as in biosciences. I think that tools like Hypothesis, this kind of open web annotation tool, which is now integrated in with the Open Science Framework and kind of available to preprint communities, I think that kind of open annotation is a potential game changer for how we look at reviewing, not just moderating, but really peer engagement and review of preprints, where people can interact with the publication in a very granular, contextual way. So what's the best way to preserve those annotations and reviews along with the preprint? I mean, these are all going to be big questions for us. How do we handle subsequent versions? It is a fairly well-established practice that preprints cannot be withdrawn from services. So version control through the DOI and other mechanisms is going to be critical. And Crossref has been an active partner in this space and are working with both publishers and preprint communities on this. So other kinds of questions, how do I know, which have come up, how do I know what to read if it's all in this big repository or of preprints and it's not in a journal that I know, how do I know what to read? And we've all, sort of all of us librarians, researchers, everyone has relied on tools like, is it peer reviewed? Is it in a journal I recognize? And those are the kind of filters that we use to know what to read. But we're going to have to, so how are we going to understand kind of new metrics like thousands of downloads pre-peer review in this kind of environment? But there are some very, very interesting experiments around overlay journals. So this is back to the kind of enthusiasm around academy-owned or library infrastructure. Earlier this year, some prominent mathematicians launched, and I'm sure I'll mess up this pronunciation, advances in combinatorics, built entirely on the archive repository. So the publisher in this case is Queen's University Library using the Scholastica platform. Martha Whitehead, who's the university librarian at Queen's, said at the time, quote, as libraries, we need to nurture and invest in new models that will contribute to a more sustainable and inclusive system for research communication. So I think both Will and Philip mentioned inclusivity as a kind of goal of this. She then said, we are delighted to be able to support this innovative approach to journal publishing. So something that may overlay journals might be one direction that the social sciences embrace. They might invent something new still. But we only are going to find out the answers to these questions by working very closely with the research community. And as libraries, if we take a kind of expansive view of the scholarly record, we have the opportunity to influence kind of how these services are architected and evolve, and then really a great opportunity to preserve and study the structure of knowledge creation itself and the dynamics of research for our communities. So I'm very optimistic about this. I'm excited to be a part of SocArchive, and I think we all welcome your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. I was frantically typing my own questions and monitoring the chat while you were talking, Judy, because we have some great questions. Some questions came up about the Open Science Framework and whether, specifically for LISA, there were options to link out to material that's already in the Open Science Framework under other rubrics, say for the repositories for the DLF forum or other entities. And I wondered, Judy, if you would be able to answer that.
Sure. So, I mean, the OSF, as a kind of so when you deposit a paper in any of these services, I mean, the kind of the preprint service model here is that when you deposit a paper in these services through the OSF, it creates a project creates what they call an OSF project for you. So you get project space kind of automatically to put additional materials. And so that can all be within kind of a contained space, but if you're a user of the Open Science Framework or if there are other things on it, so that's a great example, they host meetings like DLF or CNI has put papers there, that you can link out to those fairly easily.
Thank you. And I appreciate you interpreting my interpretation of that question, which I think I'm sort of medium at doing. So excellent answer. One question I had, and this might be pulling from my own personal biases, how do we talk to our faculty and researchers about when they might want to use a preprint repository and when they might want to use the library's local institutional repository? And I guess for me, the subtext of that is, as an academic library, are we better off putting resources toward our local IR, or are we better off applying resources toward researcher support services and disciplinary support? So I would love to hear from the whole group on that.
I can say one thing about that. We don't try to talk people out of using their institutional repositories at all. Our attitude generally is, if the metadata is good and everything's accessible, it doesn't make a difference to us. That's kind of idealistic, I realize. Some people like to post things in multiple places. That can get kind of confusing, but it's not necessarily wrong. But ideally, I think we would have sort of the dual submission model or some kind of interoperability so that we could get the benefits of doing both of those things at once. Our main goal is getting people to not just slap it up on their own website.
Yeah, this is Will. I'll add to that. Lots of copies keep stuff safe, right? Like that's Library 101. I think that point that a repository is an institutional repository is increasingly not best understood as a box where you put stuff, but more as sort of the connective tissue that goes out to a larger sort of scholarly ecosystem and environment is the right answer. So for us, our IR is about connecting to where scholars naturally want to put stuff rather than forcing them to bring everything into our backpack in the library or whatever, right? So scholars oftentimes feel a different sort of connection with their discipline than they do for their institution. So for us, saying, hey, put it in SciArchive, SocArchive, Law Archive, whatever, and then we'll connect to that space so that we have a record of it, whether that's storing a physical PDF or just saying, here's where to find that, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think the only thing I might add to that is, I absolutely agree with both of those comments, and I think, the larger scholarly communication ecosystem that Will mentioned, includes things like faculty profiling systems and other kinds of sort of bibliographic or, other kinds of ways that librarians are trying to, sort of manage the scholarly record locally. So whether that, means that that's deposits in the IR or whether it means that they're connected to other things, there are other tools to sort of accomplish that knowledge management that don't involve involve working with multiple players. So I definitely see them as non-competitive.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate those answers. I'm seeing some questions that all fall under a common thread to my mind, particularly for librarians. These are not surprising questions. So I'm going to put them all under one umbrella and ask for the panelists to weigh in on what do you see as the big questions in the future in terms of things like version control and DOIs and ORCID. I think we've touched on this a little bit, but is there some development or some philosophical piece that could provide us a little reassurance as librarians? I see a lot of questions in the chat about, well, what if there's 2 DOIs, or what if there's multiple versions? Judy, I was so happy to hear you mention open peer review, which I'm keen on as well. So any philosophical or future forward thoughts from our panelists on those questions?
Well, I mean, I'll give the obvious answer, which is I think this is exactly why this is part of our strategic interest in participating in architecting these services, is exactly to bring those kinds of questions and to bring that expertise around, you know, bring the prior expertise we have or understandings we have around version control, but also, you know, to imagine what those new systems will look like. So, I mean, I think, you know, I think that these preprint services have benefited from having people on their advisory boards kind of asking those questions, and in some cases, you know, giving advice directly to COS about, you know, how to manage some of these things. But I think that, I mean, I guess one philosophical thing, and I'll, you know, turn this over to the people in the services, but one philosophical question is kind of at what point can we you know, put a preprint out and have the peer community engage with it, write reviews, open reviews, and you know that is the version. You know, that sort of you know, do we always have to have the kind of understanding of what this shared work is, or can we kind of build robust services you know, in conjunction with these preprint services that where these really do become the scholarly record and the version.
I think that's a really great point, Judy. To me, one of the things that's really exciting about all these conversations is a recognition that scholarship has never been necessarily a static document, right? That the scholarly conversation has only been sort of calcified in this version because that was sort of the best way we could do it. But if to the extent that scholarship is an ongoing conversation, that you have discussion that leads to the research, and the research is improved upon through open peer review, and then it's published in a journal and people respond to that, that I'm totally in favor of anything that says let's capture the conversation in a larger way rather than defaulting to the sort of the old, this is the only version that matters, everything else before that and after that is not real or not valuable. I think finding ways to talk more richly about the way that scholarship is always a collaborative conversational process is all for the good.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I just add one thing that it's hard sometimes to see how we can work sort of within the existing reward and incentive structures, and that's a big challenge for people who are trying to manage their careers while sort of being part of, you know, exciting new developments. One nice thing is sort of following the lead of the people who developed sort of citation for data sets. I think the citation practices where people are citing preprints, but also where people can cite comments and discussion and other research materials. And, you know, DOIs are sort of the shorthand for how that's done, but we need to, you know, like Will says, capturing the conversation can also mean citing it in ways that also bring rewards to the participants.
Exactly, and that's Publian's and that's hypothesis, and that's all those great things that Judy talked about.
I don't have my camera on, so you can't all see me nodding in agreement, but I found that a very inspiring set of answers to those questions, and I think it gives us all a lot to think about moving forward in the profession. One question that came up in the chat that I think relates is, how do these preprints fit into our existing tenure, promotion, and reappointment processes? And I just wondered if any of the panelists had thoughts on how to maybe move the bureaucratic machine of the academy along as quickly as the scholarly conversation is evolving.
I could say one thing about that. Like I said, you know, posting a paper on Social Archive is not an accomplishment you can brag about. However, it's very common for people in my discipline and others to put, works in progress on their CV. And often it's just a title, and it's sort of like, well, what is that? So I love the idea that sort of among the people who are paying attention to these questions of assessment and metrics, that that we should actually read the work. That preprints are becoming a more established way to present work in progress and actually let people look at it and consider it. So instead of just saying, I have written a working paper, see, here's the title, you show the work. That's point number one. Point number two is that the citations to preprints are citations, and they count. They're counted on some, some platforms count them and some don't. Google Scholar does. Google Scholar does a pretty good job of allowing people to also aggregate the citations to their preprint and then their later on published version. Takes a little finagling sometimes by authors, but the information is there, so that's a help also.
Okay, I'll jump in.
Oh, please go ahead.
Sorry, Will. I think, I guess one answer is that I think that as there are increasing funder mandates around, sharing, rapid access, speeding up the timeline, things like that, data sharing, sort of part of that whole kind of package of concerns, is a real understanding that this piece of it has to be nudged along as well. And I think that, one of the ways that libraries as, library infrastructure, the people, the repositories, the kind of expertise, lent to these services, I think one of the ways we contribute is if there's a robust kind of discovery and preservation and publication environment for these things, they will be easier they will be easier to reward because they will persist, and they won't be sort of seen as. I think one of the things, it's not just, I think Philip had a slide where it said OA is considered of lesser quality. Sometimes it's also considered sort of fly by night, like it doesn't, is it going to still be there? And so I think that's where we really bring something to the conversation about it. But I also think it's just, there's a growing awareness that the incentives are misaligned, and there's sort of, I feel sort of optimistic that that big conversation is coming.
I feel optimistic as well, and the analogy that sort of jumped into my head is the problem that digital scholars and digital humanists are wrestling with, where you make this amazing digital scholarly project, and then you have to write a book about it, because that's the only way you're going to get credit. And the thing you did that you're proud of and was excited about was the digital thing, but you've got to sort of tie it back to this legacy. Oh, and there's a book too. So similarly, I think here there's the published article is the real thing, and the preprint is sort of ancillary to that or attached. But in the same way that digital scholars are increasingly beginning to say, hey, let's have deep conversations about how do we value and validate a digital scholarship project as distinct from the book. I think we can have those same conversations about how do you value and validate annotations and hypotheses. How do you value and validate a preprint, and metrics is a piece of that, but I think we all know sort of the challenges to the metricization of everything and to signing up for any particular type of metric, given that our friends at Elsevier basically consider themselves an analytics company at this point. So I'm optimistic about that conversation, and I feel some urgency around that conversation as well. The other part of that for me is that we talked about, like Dr. Nordman, as using SciArchive as a way to control her scholarly identity and connect to a community. And to me, the value of a preprint server as facilitating relationships and facilitating collaboration and discovery has value in and of itself that will show up in sort of tenure cases directly because, hey, I met this person and we wrote a paper that they count, and increasingly indirectly as we do a better job at measuring that other stuff that's always been really important, and we're just figuring out how to talk about well.
We have a few minutes left, and Will, your comments led perfectly into my final question here. I wanted to be sure and give all of our panelists a chance to ask questions of one another or to provide a real-life example of something done really well. And I think particularly I'm interested in cases where librarians or researchers were able to make use of these preprint repositories in a way that was innovative and exciting and really pointed toward the future. I know you've all given so many great examples, and I feel personally that I could refer researchers to any of these archives and know that there are real people there with a real interest and excitement and dedication, and they would be happy to help. But I'm interested to hear from you, again, questions for each other or just fantastic examples from the field that you'd want to make sure we know about.
All right, I'll give an example. I don't know how many of the people here recently heard the big news that divorce is falling for millennials. That was a piece of my research, which I posted on Social Archive at the same time that I submitted it to a conference. Because I am, all on Twitter all day long, had some journalists who follow me. A journalist saw me mention it and circulated the paper himself to a couple of other experts. So he had sort of organized his own peer review before writing a story, which was great. Then he wrote a story in Bloomberg, which got a lot of attention, and the thing exploded. It was all over the place. It was on the Today Show and BuzzFeed and stuff like that. And I thought it was a great sort of, it's an easy for me model because I'm, like I have this network of people who already pay attention to my work. So it's easy for me to say, but in this case, it was something that was not analytically very complicated. It was just sort of news on the trend. We were able to get it out quickly. And I got sort of instant review from the very people I would love to be the reviewers for it. If that thing gets published in a journal someday, that's great. If it doesn't, it really doesn't bother me. It's already served its mission. And if I get to present it at the conference, that'll be great. But in the meantime, paper's been downloaded a few thousand times from Social Archive, and it was reported all over the place. So it was a total win. And because of all the people who looked at it, I feel like it's basically been peer reviewed. So I thought that was an interesting, for me, very gratifying example.
So I don't have an example of it, unfortunately. I'm searching for one, but I think one of the arguments that we didn't quite make, but I still believe in. Philip said, we have to make it okay to be wrong. It has to be okay, and Will said it's sort of a variation of the same thing. It has to be okay to put work out there in good faith that might have mistakes in it, and if we kind of lower the bar on what that means, and people find those mistakes and tell you, this is how scholarship really improves fast. So I wish I had an example of it, but I believe in that.
That's a really good point. And I actually have a question. It's a question I saw sort of flashing by in the chat, and it's one that I've been wrestling with in OER land in particular, is the licensing question. That most services, including, I believe, Social Archive and SciArchive, support CC BY and CC 0, but have not sort of chosen to offer formal support for some of the other licenses. Although, as Philip noticed, you can post with no license and then add your own little, license in another way. And I've seen a lot of conversations about how committed are we to sort of the purity of openness versus the welcoming different approaches and different perspectives. Particularly as the monetization of open stuff is happening more and more. I'm curious what you all think about how we sort of chart a course between openness means something, and we have values and licenses that are related to that, and we don't want to be so purist that we sort of force out huge segments of the population who would like to come play with us, but they really want to put that CC/NC license on there or that sort of thing. It's a big question with 2 minutes, I know.
I'll answer that. I think we are still in a phase of experimentation. So in the spirit of experimentation, I would err on the side of inclusion in trying to build this future.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I posted in the chat an essay that Judy wrote with Krista Cox on the license, our approach on Social Archive. so I don't have anything to add beyond that. I think that's exactly right.
Well, we have exactly 1 minute left, and I want to be sure to take time to thank all of our panelists, Will, Judy, and Philip. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely enlightening and a fantastic discussion. And a huge thank you to all of our participants for joining us this afternoon and for all of their great questions. I see a comment from one of our EBSS members who actually was one of the suggesters of this topic. So thank you to Amy. This was a really popular topic. I know many people will be coming to the recording of this. Once I have the link to the recording, I'll send it out to the listservs and to our panelists so that we can share it with other interested folks. And with that, it's 3 p.m. Mountain Time, so I will call this to a close, and thank you all. Have a great Halloween.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.